So my name is Tal, and I'm going to be talking to you about marketplaces. So a little bit about me. I've been in product for about 10 years. I'm currently on my second on-demand marketplace startup. So about 10 years ago, I co-founded a company called Flywheel. So it was a on-demand taxi app. And since then, I've worked at a number of companies, including some startups no one's ever heard of and Amazon. And right now, I'm at a company called WAG, which you can think of as Uber for dog walking. And our PM team right now is only 3. So I'm really product managing across both the supply side, so the dog walkers, the demand side, the people who want their dogs walked, and the marketplace health, so that intersection between the two, that where we really want to keep things balanced and keep those transactions really frictionless. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is the difference between interfaces and marketplaces. So this distinction might seem obvious, but it wasn't to me when I started out in marketplaces. And I learned the hard way just how much knowing that distinction and really recognizing it can completely change the trajectory of your product strategy and of your entire company. So to show you just how drastically it can do so, let me show you my alternate title for this slide. True story. True story. And now you get to hear it. Luckily, Dan already queued up this whole part and covered half of what I was going to say a little bit differently, so bear with me. We're going to go through it again from a different angle. So 2008, 10 years ago, yes, I might be aging myself a bit here. This is how you got a cab. And this is a screenshot from 3 days ago. It didn't look as good. But if you wanted a taxi to get anywhere, you had 2 options. The first one is you could try to find all the phone numbers of your local cab companies and call them one by one to see who would be available if you needed a cab. It was the worst, right? So you had these gruff operators put you on hold for a while, then they tell you the cab's going to be there in 15 minutes, and 45 minutes later it's not there, you have to call back. Either that, or you're standing on a street corner for sometimes 10, 20 minutes freezing your face off because you're trying to get somewhere. And it's a terrible experience, and no one liked it. And so a few of us thought, well, couldn't we make this better? Couldn't we take advantage of mobile phones, and the App Store just launched, and we have GPS, and can't we give drivers and passengers X-ray vision into one another, and also remove the burden of that human dispatcher in the middle to try to match the supply and demand? And so in 2009, we launched an app called Cabulous, which was since rebranded as Flywheel. I don't know if you've seen those red taxis on the street in San Francisco. Same thing. So this is going to look like a pretty familiar interface for any of you that have used Uber and Lyft, but neither of those companies existed at the time. But you're like, wait, I've never heard of this. Yeah, I'm going to tell you why. So as Dan was saying before, there are must-haves and there are delighters. What we built was very much the delighter. We made it really, really simple to see what cabs were available, hail them with a touch of the button, and then actually see where your car was as it arrived to pick you up, so you could stay inside of the comfort of your own home or wherever you were, right? Experience probably pretty familiar to all of us now. However, when do people actually need cabs? But I don't know, for those of you who remember the days before Uber, it was impossible to get a car on a Friday or Saturday night, which is when the entire city wanted one. So the majority of the time when people opened up the app, this is what they saw. Well, that's shit. So we built the delighters without building the must-haves, which had nothing to do with the interface itself. It had to do with the underlying market forces. And it was that the entrenched, highly regulated taxi industry did not have supply when people actually needed it. Weekend nights, right? And so, 2010, oh, look at that. Pretty similar. Very flattering, actually. So what was the difference here? Not only did they build the delighters, but Uber's entire product and business strategy was around solving the marketplace problem underneath. They built, sure, they just borrowed our interface. That's fine. I'm not bitter. No, I'm not actually. I'm flattered. But what they did, and it's frankly, it's extremely admirable, is that they looked deeper and realized that this is all well and good, but what people really just want is just to be able to get a cab in the first place when they need one. And that no fancy iPhone app was going to solve that problem. And so for us, Flywheel, we were myopic. We bet our entire strategy on the existing broken marketplace, which left us vulnerable to a disruptor like Uber who could come in and have a very similar interface, but have an entirely new marketplace underneath it, which was a healthier one with dynamic supply and demand. We all know that story. But anyway, for what it's worth, we were actually still able to accomplish a lot. We managed to solve the chicken and the egg problem by starting with supply, the cab drivers, which if you're building a marketplace is most likely what you're going to do, especially if you don't have an existing product. And we managed to somehow build a balanced marketplace on both sides. And now at WAG, I've come in where there's already that marketplace, and I'm really trying to figure out how do we take that traction and really refine that into an incredibly efficient marketplace with a really delightful experience on both sides. So I've really seen both the beginning and kind of that growth stage. And I'm going to talk a bit about how you build for both as a PM. But first of all, the foundation are the metrics. So a lot of these are going to look really familiar to you. If you've taken a product school course, which, by the way, I was an instructor last year. Some of my students are here. Or if you work as a PM, all of these are going to look incredibly familiar. You'll say, oh, I know all about this. But this isn't the whole picture. Let's talk about a situation. We have a product team on both sides, buyers and sellers. Let's call it, let's talk about any on-demand app, right? Say I'm building an on-demand app for massages. I find 1,000 masseuses who would love to get more business and are willing to be on my app, even if I won't be able to get them customers for a while, because it's no effort for them to do so, right? Build an account once, then they wait until demand comes. And then say I get all of those masseuses in New York City. And then on the buyer side, in this case, the people who want massages, now that I've queued up all these masseuses, I go and find 1,000 people who I managed to get through this funnel who want to book a massage. But say, instead of being in New York, they're all in Chicago. No one gets a massage. No one makes money, right? It sucks. So if you can't just look at these in a vacuum, how do you measure the success of the marketplace itself as opposed to just these metrics on both sides? Well, I'm going to introduce a few concepts to you. Liquidity, concentration, GMV. There are several more, but I'm going to talk through these, especially liquidity, which, if you learn nothing else about PMing a marketplace, is the most important one to know. Liquidity is king. It's the liquidity determines how well you've solved the, masseuses in 1,000 masseuses here, 1,000 customers there problem. So what it is, it's the percent of buyers and sellers that are able to transact within a certain time period. So how likely are you as a buyer, let's call it, for all of you have probably used Uber or Lyft. So if you say want a ride, how likely are you able to get what you want, a ride, if you're a driver, get passengers in an acceptable time frame? You'll probably cancel your Uber if it's 30 minutes away, right? And at a price you're willing to pay. Some people are willing to pay different prices, right? And you're also probably willing to pay more or less depending on your situation. For drivers, there's a payout. You have to pay them enough that they're willing to continue giving rides on the platform and don't switch over to Lyft if they're on Uber, or vice versa. And so if you look at that percentage and say you have 99% on both sides, that means that everyone's able to get what they want. But if you only have 50%, that means that your marketplace is probably either imbalanced or something's wrong with your pricing. And you as a PM, even if you have business people, can't really create a product strategy or roadmap without really understanding some of those fundamentals and how they interact with one another. So now that we've talked through that, let's talk about what your high-level roadmap might look like from a goals and strategy standpoint to launch a new marketplace. And that can be a new startup, or it can be a marketplace at a large enterprise company, for example, the app marketplace that was launched on top of Salesforce. So what you want to do is most often start with supply. Say chicken, everyone talks about the chicken or the egg. The answer is usually whichever one the supply is. And what you want to do is have a flippable switch, make it effortless to turn on the supply as soon as the demand is ready, assuming they're in the same city. And so for Flywheel, what we had to do was identify the friction points for our supply. And these were cab drivers. So one friction point was the hardware. Not all of them had iPhones. Education. Not all of them had ever even used a smartphone. They weren't tech savvy. Third one was financial. These are people who already don't have much disposable income, and we weren't proven, so we couldn't charge them anything. So in order to give ourselves that flippable switch, we actually put the phones in their hands for those that didn't have them. We didn't charge anything up front for them to use it, since we couldn't promise them demand up front. And we spent hours and days in the cab yard educating all of them on how to use it before we even had one customer for them, so that they felt comfortable turning on the app as soon as we told them we'd like them to. And also we built relationships with them and got them excited about evangelizing for us and giving us a chance that, frankly, had we just tried to market to them online, would have never worked. So think about think beyond digital marketing and figure out what do you really need to resolve those friction points, many of which are in the real world. Next one is getting the user to transaction and avoiding bells and whistles. Everyone has that boss or that coworker that always wants to add a million shiny new features. They're like, what if, people don't want to buy our widgets because we don't have, I don't know, some crazy, we don't have contests. We don't have, a magic pricing tool. There are always people who just want to add 5 million features to your product. However, every time you add a feature, you're increasing the cognitive complexity for your users. And also, you're distracting them from getting them to the transaction. If you're building Pinterest and your product is really dependent on people engaging for long periods of time, great. However, in a marketplace, your customers don't want to come there to hang out for long periods of time. They want to find what they need as soon as humanly possible. And your job as a PM is to advocate for them and get them there. So how might you do that? For example, search and navigation. If you're building an online marketplace, say for e-commerce is a type of marketplace, or even a marketplace like Yelp, where you're going to be looking for specific vendors as opposed to just hitting an on-demand button, your search and navigation is going to be the real arbiter of how fast you can get users to transaction. So you really want to spend a lot of your time making sure the navigation in your app or site is incredibly intuitive, and that the search facets and functionality you have really mirror users' mental models of that. Concentration is another important one that I'm going to talk about. And that can be either concentration in a niche or geographical. So what niche concentration means, if you're trying to launch a Craigslist killer, marketplace for people to buy and sell things, do you think you're better off launching with 50 categories and 1 to 2 items each? Or really nailing the furniture category and giving customers in a certain place 100 things to choose from? Probably the latter. So you really want to have concentration in a way that makes sense for your users. Geographical concentration is also known as density, and you can measure that by your standard radius. So for example, whether it's dog walkers or cab drivers or masseuses, there's probably a certain number of options or a certain number of supply or demand that need to be within the same location as one another in order for that transaction to take place. I'm not going to go walk someone's dog if they're 10 miles away and I'm taking public transit. Just like you, as someone who's booking a massage, and if you want one right now, you don't want someone who needs to take 2 hours to get there. And that person probably isn't going to make enough money. So as a marketplace, if you're a local marketplace, you really need to understand what's the relationship between density and liquidity. How does increasing the density affect how many transactions take place? And you'll see that as density increases, liquidity, the percentage of people who transact tends to improve. So say you've reached critical mass. You're starting to get traction on both sides. You want to know what to do next. You're really getting momentum and you're getting excited. Don't be complacent. You want to resist the urge to add bells and whistles still, because there's still a lot more you can do in terms of optimizing what you already have and reducing that friction. So, for example, when we first launched Flywheel, you still had to pay for your cab with either cash or a credit card, using, say, Square or the hardware that was in the cab. So eventually, when Uber added the ability to pay through the app, we're like, oh yeah, hell yeah, we have to do that too. And the benefit there is that it really reduced the friction for that whole transaction, part of which is the paying and getting out of the cab. So you might think of what are additional things we can do now that we have this scale and can actually justify making these larger investments to continue reducing that friction. Building trust. If you're building a marketplace like Airbnb, where you really have to trust that you're not staying with a serial killer, or that the person who is crashing at your pad isn't going to burn your house down, you really need to make sure you have a roadmap for trust in place. Ratings, reviews, comments, testimonials, background checks. At WAG, that's important as well. Because while you're willing to get early adopters who will sleep on a stranger's air mattress without knowing who they are, you're not going to be able to expand to the mainstream like Airbnb did without really putting in enough trust mechanisms to appeal to your average customer. Determining optimal take rate for GMV. This is a mouthful. If you don't know your marketplaces, you're probably like, what the hell are you talking about? So let's break this down. GMV stands for gross merchandise value. You're probably heard about, a lot of startups and companies track revenue. Marketplaces track GMV. This is the amount of money that is going through the system. Take rate is the platform's cut of it, right? If we have two sides selling and buying widgets for one another, our take rate is maybe 10% or 20%, or maybe it's $1 per transaction. And our GMV is our commission plus what we pay out to the seller, right? So our net revenue is going to be lower than our GMV, but GMV is really what we're always trying to grow, because take rate can change. And then the last one is matching efficiency for real-time marketing conditions. Again, another handful. But real-time market conditions are really critical when you're talking about on-demand marketplaces like Flywheel, Uber, and WAG. Because when immediacy is key for both sides, I'm driving in a cab, I want a passenger, I'm standing on the street corner, I'm drunk, I need a ride. Supply and demand are really ephemeral, and everything changes. If you don't get me a passenger quickly enough, or if you don't give me a ride quickly enough, I'm going to churn if it happens over and over. I'm going to find another way to make money or another app that will get me around. And so the functionality required to respond to these fluctuations are often entire product areas. In fact, the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world have product teams whose sole focus is responding to the changing market conditions and supply and demand by changing routing, pricing, etc. So to really show you why this is critical, I'll give you an example of your typical e-commerce site on the left, where over a 2-month period, your supply is actually really predictable. You know, as people buy things, it's going to keep going down. Then you're going to reorder something, and then the inventory is going to go back up. This is one day in Uber. These peaks and troughs are their supply and demand. Without being able to adjust the pricing and adjust the routing in real time to respond to this, half these people are going to have awful experiences. So a lot of what Uber's success has been, as you guys know, surge pricing. We all hate it. But it's made sure that everyone who is willing to pay and wants a ride can get one, although willing to pay is going to change a lot based on the pricing at the time. So the last thing I want to talk about is for those of you who might be interested in potentially working as a PM for a marketplace, is do I need to know all this? Do I need to like go back and take Econ 101 again or for the first time in order to actually be able to do my job? And the answer is probably not, but it actually varies wildly based on your product area and size of company. At WAG, we're 3 people. So much of our trade-offs and our product roadmap has to do with liquidity and the balance on both sides and how to reduce friction from that transaction. And so we really need to understand the underlying economics in order to be able to properly prioritize our roadmap and understand what we need to build. However, at a larger company, you might not only be focused on a small piece of that. And so you need to know at least enough to know what matters for your particular product area, and really enough to evaluate a company's strategy. Since if you're joining a marketplace company, you want to evaluate it more holistically to determine if it's going to be more of a Flywheel or more of an Uber. So just to give you an example, I actually screenshotted Uber's current product manager openings. And what you'll see is there are a few roles for whom the economics are probably going to be really important. Marketplace, rider pricing. They really need to understand these things down to a T. However, if you're the product manager on trust and safety, does it matter if you're a budding economist or not? Probably not. What's probably a lot more important is for you to have empathy with people and really get to know your customers and understand how that prevents them from transacting if that trust or safety isn't there. But maybe don't really need to understand a lot of the concepts that someone on the pricing side does. So at larger companies, it's, there's really an entire menu and a lot of different permutations as far as what you need to understand. Anyway, so I hope I was able to give you a bit of an overview of what it really takes to build a marketplace as a product manager at a number of stages, the real metrics that determine the success of a marketplace, and that cascade down to metrics that a lot of us are already familiar with, and also give you a sense of what has worked both for me and both for other companies that have had some success, even if limited success as marketplaces, and hopefully you've gotten some of you excited about potentially working at one day. It's hard as hell, but I wouldn't, right now I wouldn't trade it for anything else. Thank you.